Fantasy has always been known for its grand world building, ancient histories, intricate magic systems, and epic battles, and for a long time that was the heart of the genre. But in recent years, fantasy has been evolving, blending elements from other literary genres that focus on rich, character-driven storytelling. Writers are paying more attention to what makes characters feel human, their struggles, relationships, inner conflicts, and complex contradictions. While the world might still be vast, it's no longer just about kingdoms and wars, it's about people and their stories.
I'm not saying the characters in early fantasy were completely flat, but I am saying they often weren't the focus of the genre. I think the way the industry works now allows for more genre-bending exploration, and this benefits fantasy, which is evolving beyond just the traditional tropes and embracing the nuance and complexity of real human experiences. A lot of the best stories now, they feel more intimate, driven by characters who are messy, conflicted, and full of contradictions, and POVs with strong character voices. So in this video, we're going to break down how to create characters like that. Ones who stand out, feel real, and make us feel emotionally connected to them, even in a setting that's completely out of the ordinary and reality. So let's get to it.
Character-driven fantasy shifts the focus from grand external events to the inner lives of its characters. Unlike plot-driven stories where the primary emphasis is on what happened and how events connect, character-driven fantasy is all about who these people are, what they want, and how their decisions shape the story. The plot becomes a tool for exploring personal growth, relationships, and conflict. Every twist and turn are grounded in the choices and emotions of the characters, making the story feel more intimate and resonant, even in a vast fantastical world.
World building as well can be used in many different ways as allegories for the journeys the author wants to put the characters through. To me, this is a more sophisticated approach to writing and world building than just including interesting world building details for your setting because you think they seem cool, with no synergies with anything else that's happening in the story.
One of the hallmarks of character-driven fantasy is its morally complex characters. These aren't your traditional heroes and villains, clearly divided by good and evil. Instead, they're layered and flawed, with conflicting motivations and values. They make bad decisions, act out of selfishness or fear, and sometimes even betray their own principles. But it's these imperfections that make them so compelling. We might not always agree with their choices, but we understand why they make them. However, there is still complexity in morally simple characters. You can have a clear hero for a complicated and interesting inner life. Think of the best stories of Superman. His inner struggle is not about questioning his own moral compass, it is about how to better apply this moral compass to the challenges he faces. So once again, even though morally gray characters are interesting, a clear hero or a clear villain don't necessarily mean shallow characterization. But another great example is Robin Hobb's Farseer trilogy. Fitz chivalry, Farseer's life is full of personal losses, betrayals, and tough moral choices. The story rarely focuses on grand battles or world-changing events. Instead, it's about Fitz's emotional journey, his struggles with identity, loyalty, and survival. The external events matter, but what makes the story unforgettable is how those events transform Fitz and those around him.
In these stories, the world is filtered through the eyes of the characters, giving the reader a more personal experience. Their thoughts, doubts, and desires shape how we perceive the world around them. So the story unfolds through their emotional lens. It often reveals the same event in drastically different ways, depending on whose point of view you're seeing. This internal focus creates rich layers of tension and drama, and rich in different interpretations of the world you created based on whose character is looking at it. The relationships also evolve in unpredictable ways, and character growth becomes the true heartbeat of the story, overshadowing just the machinations of the plot.
I think to create distinct and memorable characters, it's essential to give each one a unique perspective on the world around them. Every character should have specific goals, fears, and biases that shape how they view events and make decisions. Take Game of Thrones. Tyrion Lannister, Jon Snow, and Cersei Lannister all interact with power in completely different ways. Tyrion sees it as a game of survival and wit, Jon approaches it with reluctant duty, and Cersei treats it as her birthright, wielding it with ruthless ambition. These differing perspectives not only create engaging characters but also fuel the story's conflicts.
Relationships are also the heartbeat of character-driven storytelling, and the best ones are built on conflict and tension. When characters have different beliefs, priorities, or emotional wounds, their interactions become unpredictable and very layered. So just these differences with different ways of seeing the world, they naturally create conflict, which is great for the story. Alliances form and fall apart, friendships are tested, and love turns to hate and vice versa. Conflicts originated from different philosophical point of views are also a good way for thematic exploration.
In Lost, John Locke is the man of faith, someone who is willing to see what happens on the island as miracles, because he himself was cured from being a paraplegic when they got there, while Jack is the man of science, someone incredibly stubborn to accept anything supernatural. Both these men are in leadership positions, and their decisions are clearly influenced by their world view and are often opposed, which is a very easy and thematically rich way to generate conflict in your story. Great characters live in two realities, the world around them and the world inside their heads. Developing a character's inner world, what they believe about themselves versus how others perceive them, adds depth and complexity. A character might see themselves as brave and principled, while others view them as reckless or stubborn. This disconnect creates opportunities for growth, tension, and revelation. Let's use The Blade itself by Joe Abercrombie to explore how to establish distinctive POV chapters for some of your characters. In the series, each character has a distinct perspective that reflects their personality, experiences, and biases. Logan, Nine Fingers, the weary survivor, or the infamous Bloody Nine, is one of the most complex characters in The Blade itself. His chapters are marked by a melancholic tone and a weary pragmatism born from years of hardship and bloodshed. Logan's voice is calm, reflective, and often filled with dark humor. He's constantly trying to distance himself from his violent past, yet he knows that survival means embracing the brutal man he once was. One of his signature phrases, "Say one thing about Logan Nine Fingers, say he's a survivor," perfectly encapsulates his philosophy. Simple, fatalistic, and deeply self-aware. The structure of his internal monologue is straightforward, reflecting his practical mindset, but it's also laced with moments of surprising wisdom and vulnerability. Then we have Jezal Dan Luther, the arrogant nobleman. His chapters are the most light-hearted and ironically self-important, a stark contrast to Logan's grim reflection. As a privileged nobleman with delusions of grandeur, Jezal's internal voice is filled with entitlement and vanity. His perspective is narrow and selfish. He sees the world as a stage for his inevitable greatness. Abercrombie plays with this by making Jezal completely blind to his own flaws, turning his chapters into a satire of aristocratic arrogance. The language in his chapters is flowery and inflated, mirroring his inflated sense of self. Through Jezal's eyes, the world seems shallow and controllable, until reality humbles him in brutal fashion. We also have Sandan Glokta, the bitter cynic. Glokta's chapters are some of the most distinctive in the novel, dripping with bitterness and dark humor. Once a proud soldier, Glokta is now a crippled torturer whose body is broken and racked with constant pain. His inner monologue is a razor-sharp commentary on everything around him. Nothing escapes his brutal, sardonic observation. Every scene is colored by his physical suffering, which manifests in repetitive thoughts about his aching body and the difficulty of even simple movements. His chapters often switch between his spoken words, which are polite and controlled, and his internal thoughts, which are biting and cruel. The dissonance between what he says and what he truly thinks creates a very interesting voice that perfectly captures his fractured, embittered psyche. Finally, we have Pharaoh Mulgin. Her chapters are written with a distinct staccato rhythm that reflects her intense, single-minded focus. Her perspective is brutal and stripped of unnecessary detail. Long paragraphs broken by short, sharp sentences that hit like hammer blows. Pharaoh's world is one of survival and vengeance, and her chapters reflect that through their relentless pacing and lack of introspection. She doesn't dwell on what has happened or what could happen. She lives purely in the moment, driven by rage and the need to destroy her enemies. To Pharaoh, the world is a hostile place filled with enemies and dangers, and that view is unrelenting in every word of her chapters.
So Abercrombie's mastery of character writing lies in his ability to make each voice distinct, raw, and full of idiosyncrasies. Every chapter feels like stepping into a different person's mind. The writing for each character has its own cadence, biases, and emotional weight. He ensures that each perspective feels both authentic and immersive, and he makes us truly feel who the characters are through their language, thoughts, and interactions. This is what elevates the Blade itself beyond the standard fantasy novel into something richer and more personal. It's a story that's not perfect, but it excels at being entirely shaped by the characters. Another really good aspect of characterization, and also something that Abercrombie does really well, it's highlighting how each characters perceive one another and how vastly those perceptions differ. So his genius lies in weaving the contrasting perspectives between how a character sees themselves, how character A sees character B, how character C sees character B, so on and so forth. Because sometimes the way we see and judge other people tell more about ourselves than about the other person. And Abercrombie is really good at capturing that.
To Jezal, Glokta is nothing more than a bitter, crippled relic of a failed soldier, someone to pity perhaps, but certainly not to respect. Jezal's youthful arrogance makes him blind to Glokta's sharp intellect and the sheer resilience it takes to survive the brutal, politically charged world they inhabit. On the flip side, Glokta's view of Jezal is dripping with contempt. To him, Jezal is nothing more than a pampered, self-important brat. What makes this dynamic so compelling is how both characters' judgments are partly true, yet wildly incomplete. Neither can see the full picture, and their mutual disdain drives much of the underlying tension. Glokta's perception of Logan brings yet another perspective into the mix. Unlike Jezal, who might write Logan off as an uncivilized barbarian, Glokta sees him as something far more dangerous, a survivor and somehow with more internality than it may seem at first glance. This works by both highlighting how Glokta is an astute judge of character, he often sees people beyond the obvious, and also how Logan is much more beneath his barbarian surface. Character-driven fantasy works because when the focus is on characters' inner struggles, even the smallest stakes can feel monumental. A conversation, a decision, or a failed relationship can carry more weight than any large-scale battle. Readers invest in the characters, not just because they're likable, but because they feel real. Their pain, joy, and doubt become ours, making the emotional highs and lows of the story far more powerful and memorable.
Unlike traditional good versus evil narratives, character-driven fantasy really thrives in shades of gray, or they explore really well the price of being a full-on hero or a full-on villain. The stories explore ethical dilemmas without necessarily offering answers to them, and they challenge the reader to think beyond simply right and wrong. The characters, they make decisions that are understandable but often questionable. These decisions are often driven by personal motivation rather than just moral purity. This ambiguity makes the story feel more rounded and human, which is interesting because it leaves the readers to wrestle with their own judgment long after they finish the book. Conflict in character-driven fantasy grows naturally from within the characters themselves, of course. Their flaws, their desires, and clashing goals create drama far more compelling than any external force could. It's hard to be a big plotter in character-driven stories because if your characters are good enough and well-developed enough, they will at some point act for themselves, which doesn't necessarily align with the plot plan that you have. Two characters can be allies in one chapter and enemies in other, simply because their beliefs and ambitions no longer align. This internal tension is unpredictable and organic, keeping the readers on edge and making every interaction feel loaded with potential consequences. We need to be careful though, because if you're just letting the characters do whatever they want and already feels natural to them all the time, the plot can meander a bit. So we may need a little bit of a hand of God of the author to influence some of the events and drive things to the direction that they need to go. Once again, everything is about balance.
Character-driven fantasy is about crafting stories that feel personal, grounded, and deeply human. These stories resonate because they reflect the complexity of real life. They ask difficult questions, give us flawed but relatable characters, and remind us that even in a vast, fantastical world, the most powerful moments come from human connection and growth.
So that's it for the video today. Let me know in the comments some examples of well-written characters in fantasy or just overall good character-driven stories. Also, let me know if there are any other techniques you like to make characters distinct. And if you want to keep discussing with like-minded people about fantasy and world building, You can join our free Discord server. It's called Loregeist Tavern, and you can find the link to that in the channel's page. Thanks for watching until now, and see you next time.
Come join our Tavern discussion of fantasy storytelling and world building here at Loregeist. Give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications. Thanks for watching, and may your tales be ever epic.